So our next speaker is Mona Khalil, and Mona is a legal advisor at Independent Diplomat and an affiliate of the Harvard Law School program on international law and armed conflict. She served for 20 years in the UN, so I think that's we should have a moment of silence for him. I'm joking. and in the International Atomic Energy Agency as an expert in public international law with a focus on peacekeeping, sanctions, disarmament, and counterterrorism. During her service as a senior legal officer in the UN Office of the Legal Counsel, she undertook several special assignments, including serving as legal advisor to the Secretary General's Special Advisor on post-Saddam Iraq and to the UN mission on post-Gaddafi Libya. And she's also been a legal advisor to the UN mission to investigate allegations of the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian Arab Republic and the joint UN mission for the elimination of the Syrian chemical weapons program. Today, Mona will talk to us, will give us a talk entitled Immunity is Not Impunity. Hopefully, a moment of hope for us. Mona.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for realizing that Independent Diplomat is not my title, but my organization. The task today is a little bit more difficult than I thought it would be because we've heard such inspiring and thought-provoking discussions that I'm tempted to veer away from what I came here to say and address some of the more interesting things that I've heard since arriving this morning. But I think I'll do my subject more justice, and justice is the key to why we're all here today, if I stick to the message that I can uniquely bring, having witnessed what I like to think is not the absence of law, but the erosion of law at the United Nations. The good news is there is clear law. There is a clear policy of holding the UN accountable that the UN itself has maintained for most of its life, and that what we saw in Haiti is the exception and not the rule. Millions of dollars on an annual basis are paid out in private claims. And I'm relatively confident that had 10 people died in the cholera epidemic, there would have been immediate justice without even the need for claims. But that the numbers were such, the horror of the numbers was such that they just couldn't deal with it. And that should not be the case. It's the nature of the act, the nature of the tort, and not the number of victims that should dictate whether something is a private act or a public act, or a private law claim, or a policy claim. Even the word public policy claim doesn't even arise in the literature and jurisprudence of the convention. The question of receivability is not part of the jurisprudence, either of the charter or of the convention. The UN standard position has been maintained for decades, is that not only that justice should be done, but that it should be seen to be done. And that if and when the UN is at fault, it will hold itself responsible. U Thant in 1965 said, "We will not evade our responsibility when we cause personal injury, loss, or damage." He had to fight the permanent members of the Security Council to say that. And he did. And he said it was the obligation of the Secretariat to maintain not just the moral responsibility, but the legal liability of the organization. That was the official position of the organization as recently as the late 90s, when in two successive reports under two successive Secretary Generals, 6 months apart, they being Boutros Ghali and Kofi Annan, two separate reports were issued to the General Assembly identifying the principle of the UN's liability. So there is no question that the law exists. There is no question that the expectation, the duty, the obligation, the moral responsibility exists. And the failure to live up to that is a human failure, not an institutional one and not a legal one. And the question is, what happens when that failure occurs? What recourse do we have? Whether as those who believe in the institution and want to ensure that its moral credibility is preserved so that it has credibility when it calls upon others to live up to the law, and for the sake, of course, first and foremost, the victims. So where does my confidence that the law exists come from? It comes from the fact that our own charter, which is the bulwark of any legal framework applicable to the UN, requires good faith performance of obligations. Member states, small and large alike, are called upon in the preamble and in Article 2.2 to live up to their legal obligations and to perform them in good faith. It would be difficult to imagine a universe where the organization requiring such good faith is itself not bound by the same good faith. Even before you get into the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, even before you get into customary principles and fundamental fairness and human decency, it's a black and white rule in the Charter. It is also the hallmark of the Convention on Privileges and Immunities. It's not enough to say, oh, Article 2.2 gives immunity, absolute immunity to the organization, and only the organization can waive that immunity. Well, that's well and good, but Section 29 of the very same convention says that the organization shall, not should, not may, not might, but shall provide appropriate modes of settlement for disputes of a private international law character to which it is a party, and also to which its officials are a party when their immunity is not waived. It's not binary, immunity or accountability. It's unless you waive immunity, you must provide alternative forms of accountability. That's the formula of the convention. It's immunity and accountability. The immunity is not from justice. The immunity is not from recognizing what happened. The immunity is merely from entering into the national courts. So in a way, nobody respected the law. Not the Secretariat, not the host country that never fought for its citizens' rights, not the principal organs that didn't demand that justice be done, that the UN's record be clear, that the facts at least be established as to what role the UN had. And I'm not here to comment on the facts. It's not for me. I don't have full scope of the facts. Did they bring it in? Most likely they did. But is it not incontrovertible that it spread from the base? Even if there's a dispute as to who introduced it into the country, there seems to be sufficient public record that it spread from that base. Where is that investigation? Where is that acknowledgement? The apology issued in December 2016 merely recognizes the UN's role in dealing with it. There's zero treatment of causing it. So that accountability has yet to be established. So we have the Charter, we have the Convention, we have the SOFA. The SOFA not only requires a Standing Claims Commission, and in lieu of the Standing Claims Commission, a very effective and thus far successful local claims review board. Those local claims review boards have been dealing with torts and with claims daily around the world. Not even that was convened. Not even a BOI was convened. What we did have was an independent panel of experts, which, in a sense, confirms that the instinct, the institutional instinct, is in fact to find out what happened and to determine whether there was any responsibility. The tragedy in this case is it might have been too early, because at the time, the exact strain of the cholera was not known. And several members of that panel said that had they known, they would have had a very different posture with regard to the ultimate conclusions of the report. What the report did conclude, and which remains true, is that there was a confluence of circumstances that had the sanitation facilities, had the water treatment facilities, had the conditions of the health facilities in the country been better, the numbers would not have been 9,000 dead and 750,000 potentially infected. But that is just the extent. That's just the scope. That's just the scale. That still isn't the root cause of the situation. And was it the decisive factor? Was it the proximate cause, as we are inclined to think in terms of issues of liability and responsibility? That question has never truly been answered. So the law would require the normal state of affairs. If things were going to be normal, it would be the claim. Technically shouldn't even have to be made. If the UN becomes aware that it may have caused personal injury, loss of life, illness, and of some other physical injury, or even property damage, it should itself undertake proactively corrective measures. And if persons were harmed or successors, families have victims in their, that needs to be addressed, then the UN itself is often proactive. And we see this on a regular basis to address the wrong. Where the UN is not aware, or where it has possibly ignored, the claimant comes up and the claims procedures, whether it's the insurance, the self-insurance, in the case of a traffic accident or an accident that occurs on the premises, self-insurance takes over, and then the insurer becomes responsible for processing the claim. Or in the case of peacekeeping operations, these local claims review boards. But as late as the 1990s, even though a standing claims commission had never been convened, the UN maintained the need for those provisions to remain, precisely to make sure that there is equal fitting between the UN and the claimant, whether the claimant is the host government or the individual claimant. Those words were precisely, explicitly included in those very special reports, A51389 and A51903. I will circulate, because I didn't have time to do it electronically, the actual statement of what the principle of liability is. It's actually poetry as far as I'm concerned. It's legal poetry. It's something to be proud of. And it is the UN that I know that embodies those statements, those principles. We just failed to uphold those principles. And there may be legitimate reason for it. It may be that public international law and not private international law is at stake. But that discussion didn't take place. There was merely a decision that was communicated with terminology that had no resemblance to Section 29 of the Convention, other than asserting that Section 29 was not available. That was the public domain, the letter that was issued to the plaintiffs. Now, the plaintiffs, in a way, also did not respect the law, because the immunity is absolute. And it's quite clear in black and white that the immunity is there. What is equally clear but was never invoked was Section 29. What was equally clear but never invoked was the government's obligation to act on behalf of its nationals. So pressure could have been brought on the US government by those who were in the US to ensure that the UN lives up to its responsibility. And if you look at the dicta of the opinions of the successive stages of the US courts that ruled on this, there's always a reference to that the US government, while upholding the UN's immunity, never commented on Section 29 or the UN's position on Section 29. There was a clear opportunity there that could have been used in terms of driving a wedge in the US's appeals to the courts to uphold the immunity. The US, as host country, and as the country that we now know publicly as part of the record, was the country that pressured the UN not to give in. And not a penny or not a cent, I can't remember the exact quote, was made by the representative. And keep in mind, this is under the Obama administration, that not a penny would be paid from the regular budget. So now, 6 years later, you have two voluntary trust funds, because nothing will come out of the regular budget. And even the proposal of the current SG that the leftovers of the peacekeeping budget be attributed back to the Haiti fund has met with fierce resistance, because those are, in a sense, obligatory payments that member states make. And the US insists, and others as well, I don't mean to single out the US, that nothing come out of the calculated budgets, but only out of the voluntary ones. So again, it ends up being charity, not compensation, which is insult added to injury as far as many of us are concerned. Not out of a sense of obligation, but out of a sense of collective responsibility. And again, you look at the apology, it talks about the member states should step up. And it's true, the member states should step up, because this was done in the name of we the peoples. And to the extent that no single principal organ and no single member state, host country or otherwise, stood up and said, what's happening here? What's our role here? What's our duty here? They're all technically guilty, at least of being complicit in the erosion of the respect for fundamental principles that the Charter and the Convention uphold. So it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to think that those who not only delayed justice, but obstructed justice, whether it's those in the Secretariat or those in the US government, should be held accountable. Again, and this would be moral accountability, we're not talking about any legal accountability, for such obstruction of justice. The UN framework provides not only that responsibility must be recognized, it sets limits on that responsibility in terms of financial and temporal limits. You have to file a claim within a certain period, and the claim cannot go above a certain number unless further sort of intergovernmental action is required. But in so doing, you're also recognizing the fundamental principle that responsibility can be laid at the foot of the organization. And if and when responsibility is a result of the gross negligence, willful misconduct, or some might say criminal intent, which thankfully doesn't arise in this scenario, but certainly the question of gross negligence could arise on the part of the Nepalese forces in terms of whether or not they properly screened their soldiers before deploying them and whether or not sufficient care was taken in the base itself upon arrival in the country. Those questions have yet to be properly investigated, at least not in the public domain. And if gross negligence is established, and I'm not saying there is gross negligence, but the question should be asked, then even the troop contributing country can be held accountable. And I would imagine the contractor who was paid to maintain those standards of care in the base should also be looked at for some potential recovery of whatever the UN deems the appropriate ultimate compensation. So all of these parties have gotten off scot-free, among them being the host country, other member states, the principal organs. And I'm not saying that this to dilute the responsibility of the Secretariat, because ultimately, by practice and by policy and by example, that is the first and last stop of where the UN's credibility and the UN's position is formulated. But all of the checks and balances failed also, is all I'm saying. Not only did the institutional safeguards, checks and balances fail, but the media failed. And it really wasn't until the human rights community stepped in that anybody even noticed. I mean, those of us who were concerned about this, inside and outside, we were like, you know, somebody's going to squawk, somebody's going to scream, somebody's going to cry, somebody's going to demand justice, whether it's a member state or, you know, The Guardian or The Independent or The New York Times or whoever it was. But ultimately, it was the special rapporteurs that demanded some attention to the issue. And it was, you know, a couple of years later. When the defendants came forward, when the plaintiffs came forward through their legal representation, there was a bit of an awakening. But given that it came in the vehicle of an immunity challenge, there was, in a sense, a kind of default, like, oh, but the UN is immune, almost reinforcing the idea of this binary, because of immunity, there's no accountability, which is the exact upside down of what the convention says. That because there's immunity, there must be another form of accountability. That's what the convention says. And while it's not a quid pro quo scenario, they're two parallel but coexisting obligations, and one does not absolve the other, or else the convention doesn't make sense. And the agreement has to be read as a whole, in its entirety. Every piece of it has to be upheld. So while one does not require the fulfillment of the other to be a condition of the latter, nor is it that one obviates the need for the other. Quite the contrary, the one mutually reinforces the other to ensure that justice is done without prejudice to immunity. And if you look at the exchange of letters between the Secretary General in 1965 and the Belgian government, he acknowledges the responsibility, he acknowledges the loss of life and the damage to property. He indicates he will not evade responsibility. He indicates the amount that they will pay, and then he says, without prejudice to the immunity of the organization. So the two coexist, the immunity and the accountability. The moral responsibility and the legal accountability coexist. So what we're left with basically are four streams of accountability. Performance accountability. Did you do your job? Did you do it with care? Did you do it with the best interest of those that you're meant to serve? Because ultimately, the mandate that takes us to Haiti is the mandate to protect the people of Haiti, not to harm them. The second is the moral, which is do no harm. The third is legal. If you caused harm, you're responsible for that harm. And the fourth, again, most likely, there's zero question of criminal accountability here. Nobody intentionally caused harm. Obstruction of justice doesn't arise in a situation of civil failure to perform a civil obligation. But at least those four layers. And when all of four of them failed, and at any one point, the host country and or any member state could have invoked Article 30 of the convention, which would have sent the matter to the ICJ. So those who talk about the ICJ is not relevant because it's not available, in this case it is. Had Haiti said what you're doing is not enough, we have a difference, we must go to the ICJ to resolve it, I guarantee you it wouldn't have gotten that far, action would have been taken. But if it hadn't been, it would have gone to the ICJ. And the opinion, via the GA, the Security Council, or the ECOSOC, would have had to be accepted as decisive, even though it's an advisory opinion, because that's exactly what the convention says. So even when there's failure, the legal system provides recourse. And the UN itself, in those two reports, 389 and 903 of the 51st session, says that even if the government fails to live up to its duty to its nationals, then the UN must therefore deal with the individual claimants. That's in black and white. That is the UN that I know. So the individual claimants are part of the troika of accountability, both in the convention by virtue of Section 29 as well as in the SOFA. They talk about the UN and the claimant being on a par even. Those words are there. That we must retain the concept of a neutral, independent arbiter. That is there. So we're not left to the devices of those that are in power. And there was a day when you could trust that. When you didn't want to evade responsibility, you could trust that he would do the right thing. When Boutros Ghali said that we will not only be just, we will be seen to be just, and that was reiterated by Kofi Annan, you could trust to a certain degree that the UN would do the right thing. So what is the difference between Belgium in 1965 and Haiti in 2011? Is it that you had white victims in Belgium, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, at the time the Congo? Or is it that you have victims of color in this case? That's one paradigm that possibly explains the difference. Is it that you have governments like Belgian government that actually fought for the rights of their nationals, whereas the Haitians, because they were cowed politically or cowed militarily, or afraid to lose international support and failed to stand up for their citizens? Is that the difference between Belgium and Haiti? Also worth examining. Why didn't the Haitian government stand up for its people? Or is it the quality of leadership in the United Nations? That they were under too much pressure to resist, of too little courage of conviction to resist, or that they themselves felt cloaked in immunity and did not feel that they had to respond to the extent that they were given a way out. And if they were to look at it closely, if you look at the language in 65 and you look at the language in 1996 and 1997, there is no mention of receivability or public policy, or even of public international law. It's a question of whether it is within or outside of operational necessity. If the damage is outside of operational necessity, the UN is responsible. That's what we promised the world. If it is because of operational necessity, and we're distinguishing operational from military necessity as an IHL term, then the obligation doesn't arise because it's as a result of a mandate that is being performed and requires that specific action. You have to show that it's required. And there's nothing about what happened in Haiti that was required. Quite the contrary, what was required did not arise. So that's the formula that was evolved as the basic position of the organization and confirmed time and time again. So my suggestion, maybe revolutionary, is that we don't need a revolution. We need to go back to basics and enforce what we already have. It's quite dignified, it's quite just. We just need to actually remember that those obligations are there and ensure that they're enforced. And when the system fails, there's a fifth form of accountability, and that's public accountability, which also failed in this case. The public didn't care, the media didn't care. And it wasn't until the human rights community cared, and the likes of Philip Alston and other special rapporteurs, that anybody even noticed. And that speaks greater volumes. But finally, we do have that attention. And the question is, will the apology be sufficient? Will the appeal for mercy and humanitarian and charity be sufficient? I hope not. So with that, I'll leave you for the day.